The morning sun crept over the eastern ridge like a cautious visitor, painting the vast Wyoming grassland in shades of copper and gold. The wind moved through the tall grass with a whisper that spoke of secrets, of lives lived and lost in this endless expanse where the horizon seemed to touch eternity itself. Harland McCoy stood on his porch, a cup of bitter coffee warming his massive hands. At 6 feet 4 inches, with shoulders broad enough to fill most door frames, he cut an imposing figure against the dawn sky. The steam from his coffee rose and dissipated, much like the conversations he'd abandoned years ago in favor of this silence. His ranch sat 15 miles from the nearest town of Willow Creek, a distance he'd measured not in miles, but in the blessed absence of prying eyes and wagging tongues. The isolation wrapped around him like an old blanket, threadbare but familiar. Out here, the only sounds were those that belonged the low of cattle, the screech of a hawk, the eternal conversation between wind and grass. He took another sip, his gray eyes scanning the land that stretched endlessly before him. 300 head of cattle grazed in the middle pasture, their brown and white hides catching the early light. They were good stock, hardy enough to survive the brutal winters and smart enough to find water in the dry summers. Like him, they asked for little beyond the basics of survival. The scar on his face caught the morning light, a pale line that ran from his left temple down to his jaw. It had healed years ago, but in certain lights, like this one, it seemed to glow with its own bitter memory. He touched it absently, a habit he'd never quite broken, feeling the raised tissue that marked him as surely as any brand marked his cattle. Inside the cabin, everything sat in its proper place. A single plate, a single cup, a single chair by the fireplace. The Spartan arrangement spoke of a life pared down to essentials, of a man who'd learned that wanting little meant losing little. The walls, built from logs he'd cut and fitted himself, held no decorations save for a single photograph tucked behind the mirror, an image so faded that the faces were more suggestion than reality. He moved through his morning routine with the mechanical precision of long practice. Check the water pump, count the horses in the corral, walk the fence line nearest the house. Each task performed in silence, each movement economical and purposeful. This was how he'd rebuilt himself after Phoenix, after the blood and the accusations and the trial that had branded him in ways no iron ever could. The townsfolk of Willow Creek knew him as the giant who came to town twice a month for supplies. They knew him as the man who paid his debts promptly and spoke only when spoken to. They knew him as the rancher who'd killed 3 men in Phoenix and walked free, though the law said it was self-defense. What they didn't know was the weight of those deaths, how they pressed against his chest in the small hours of the morning when sleep wouldn't come. Martha Henley at the general store always packed his goods quickly, her hands trembling slightly as she tallied his bill. Sheriff Coleman nodded when they passed on the street but never stopped to chat. Even the saloon girls fell silent when his shadow darkened the doorway on the rare occasions he stopped for a drink. He was a story they told in whispers, a cautionary tale about the violence that lurked in men's hearts. But Harland had made his peace with their fear. Better to be left alone than to risk the alternative. He'd learned in Phoenix that sometimes defending the innocent looked like murder to those who arrived after the smoke cleared. 3 men had cornered a woman in an alley. 3 men had drawn their guns when he intervened. 3 men had died, and the woman had disappeared before the law arrived, leaving only Harland and the corpses and a story nobody quite believed even after the judge's gavel fell in his favor. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning dew. He finished his coffee and set about the day's work. There were fences to mend in the south pasture, a sick calf to doctor, and the endless maintenance that kept a ranch running. Physical labor was a blessing. It quieted the mind and tired the body enough that sleep sometimes came without dreams. By noon, sweat darkened his blue work shirt despite the autumn chill. He paused to drink from his canteen, watching a red-tailed hawk circle lazily overhead. The bird reminded him of himself, solitary, watchful, keeping its distance from the world below. There was a kind of peace in that separation, a freedom that came from having nothing left to lose. He thought sometimes about the life he might have had. A wife, perhaps, children, neighbors who smiled instead of stepping aside when he walked past. But those thoughts were like picking at a scab, painful and pointless. That life belonged to a different man, one who hadn't yet learned that good intentions could look like evil deeds in the harsh light of judgment. The afternoon stretched long and golden. He worked steadily, his large hands gentle with the animals despite their size. The cattle knew him, trusted him in the way that animals trust those who are consistent and calm. He spoke to them occasionally, his voice rusty from disuse, telling them things he could never tell another human soul. As evening approached, he made his way back to the cabin. The sky painted itself in shades of rose and amber, a daily masterpiece that he alone witnessed. He washed at the pump, the cold water shocking against his sun-warmed skin, and prepared his simple supper beans, cornbread, a strip of salt pork, the same meal he'd eaten yesterday, the same he'd eat tomorrow. But tonight, something felt different. A restlessness moved through him like the wind through the grass, a premonition that his carefully ordered world was about to shift. He stood on the porch again, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its pack, the sound lonely and wild. Harland McCoy, the giant of Willow Creek, the killer who'd walked free, the man who'd chosen isolation over the risk of human connection, couldn't shake the feeling that change was riding toward him across the darkened plains. He touched the scar on his face once more, remembering the last time he'd ignored such a feeling. That time 3 men had died. This time, he promised himself, would be different. This time, he would stay behind his fences, tend his cattle, and let the world pass by his door without stopping. He was done with being anyone's savior, done with the price that heroism extracted from those foolish enough to attempt it. But the wind kept whispering through the grass, and the stars looked down with their ancient, knowing light. And somewhere beyond the edge of his land, fate was already setting events in motion that would test every promise he'd made to himself in the long years of his self-imposed exile. He went inside and barred the door, though he knew that when trouble came, it rarely knocked. In the darkness of his cabin, he lay on his narrow bed and listened to the night sounds of the ranch. Tomorrow would be another day of silence and work and careful distance from his fellow human beings. At least, that's what he told himself as sleep finally claimed him. His large frame relaxed in the temporary peace of unconsciousness. But even in his dreams, he could hear something approaching across the vast emptiness of the plains, steady as a heartbeat, inevitable as sunrise. Change was coming to Harland McCoy's ordered world, whether he wanted it or not. The afternoon sun hung heavy in the western sky, painting long shadows across the dusty trail that wound its way toward Harland's ranch. He was mending a gap in the fence near the creek, his hands working steadily with the wire and pliers, when something made him look up. At first, it was just a speck on the horizon, a dark smudge against the golden grass that shimmered in the heat. He squinted, shading his eyes with one large hand. Not a rider, the movement was wrong, too irregular, too slow. His body tensed instinctively, muscles remembering dangers his mind tried to forget. The figure stumbled forward, disappeared behind a rise, then appeared again, closer now. Harland set down his tools deliberately, his gray eyes never leaving the approaching form. Years of solitude had taught him to read the land like scripture, and this text spoke of trouble. As the figure drew nearer, he could make out more details. A woman, her gait unsteady, weaving like a drunkard, though something in her determined progress suggested injury rather than liquor. Her dress, once blue perhaps, was torn and stained. One arm clutched her ribs while the other stretched out for balance. Harland didn't move. He stood like a statue beside his fence, watching her approach with the wariness of a man who'd learned that helping strangers could cost more than a soul could bear. The afternoon breeze carried the scent of sage and dust, and something else, the metallic tang of blood. She was perhaps 200 yards away when she fell the first time, down to her knees in the dirt, her head hanging low like a beaten horse. But she pushed herself up again, swaying, and continued her painful journey toward his ranch. He could see her face now, young, maybe 25, with dark hair that had come loose from its pins and hung in tangled strands around her shoulders. Blood. There was blood at her temple, dried dark against pale skin. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, revealing bruised flesh beneath. One eye was swollen nearly shut, the delicate skin around it purple and yellow like a violent sunset. Still, Harland didn't move. He'd made promises to himself, sworn oaths in the darkness of too many sleepless nights. The world and its troubles were not his concern. He was just a man who raised cattle and kept to himself. Nothing more. She fell again at the gate to his property, and this time she stayed down longer. He watched her struggle to rise, her movements growing weaker, more desperate. When she finally made it to her feet, she looked directly at him for the first time. Even from this distance, he could see the plea in her one good eye. She stumbled forward, made it another dozen steps, then crumpled again. This time, she crawled, dragging herself through the dust toward his porch, leaving a trail like a wounded animal. And still, he stood frozen, trapped between the man he'd been and the man he'd forced himself to become. She reached the bottom step of his porch and tried once more to stand. Her legs buckled immediately, and she caught herself on the rough wood of the stairs. With visible effort, she raised her head to look at him. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. Her breathing labored. "Please," she whispered, the word barely audible across the space between them. They beat me. I'm dying." The words hit him like physical blows. "They beat me. I'm dying." Echoes of another voice, another time, another woman he'd tried to help. That time had ended with 3 men dead and his life forever changed. But this woman was here, now, bleeding on his porch, and despite every wall he'd built around his heart, he couldn't unhear her words. She collapsed completely then, her body going limp against the steps. One hand remained outstretched toward him, fingers curled in supplication. The silence stretched between them, broken only by her ragged breathing and the distant cry of a hawk. Harland looked away, toward the endless prairie, toward the safety of emptiness and isolation. He could walk away, go back to his fence mending, pretend he'd never seen her. Someone else would find her eventually. Someone else could be the hero. Someone else could pay the price for compassion. But even as he thought it, he knew it was a lie. There was no one else. His ranch was 15 miles from town, 5 miles from the nearest neighbor. If he walked away now, she would die here, alone, her blood soaking into his land, and he would have to step over her body every morning, see her face in every shadow, hear her plea in every gust of wind. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. The scar on his face throbbed as if freshly made. Every instinct screamed at him to maintain his distance, to protect the careful life he'd built from the chaos that always followed such encounters. But beneath the fear, beneath the bitter lessons of Phoenix, something else stirred, something he'd thought dead and buried. Conscience, damn it all to hell. He still had a conscience. Moving as if through deep water, Harland walked to where she lay. Up close, the damage was worse than he'd thought. Bruises mottled her arms, finger-shaped and deliberate. Her breathing was shallow, each intake accompanied by a small whimper of pain. The blood at her temple had dried in streaks down her cheek, and he could see the swelling that suggested deeper hurt beneath. He knelt beside her, his large frame throwing her into shadow. Her good eye fluttered open, focused on him with effort. There was fear there, but also a desperate hope that made his chest tight. "Who did this?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. Her lips moved, but no sound came. He leaned closer, close enough to smell the dust and blood and fear that clung to her like a shroud. "Settlers," she finally managed. Said I owed them For passage, but I paid already." Her eye closed again, and for a moment he thought she'd passed out. Then, barely audible, "Please, just let me rest, just for a moment, then I'll go." Harland looked down at her broken form and felt the last of his resistance crumble. He couldn't save everyone. He'd learned that in Phoenix. But maybe, just this once, he could save one. Without another word, he slipped his arms beneath her and lifted her as easily as he would a child. She cried out at the movement, her body tensing with pain, but didn't fight him. Her head lolled against his chest, and he could feel the heat of fever through her torn dress. He carried her into his cabin, ducking through the doorway, and laid her on his narrow bed. She looked impossibly small there, a broken bird against the rough wool blanket. Her breathing seemed louder in the enclosed space, each rasp a reminder of how close to death she danced. Harland stood for a moment, looking down at her, then turned to gather what supplies he had. Basin of water, clean cloths, the bottle of whiskey he kept for emergencies. His hands moved with remembered efficiency, skills learned in a dozen frontier towns where doctors were scarce and self-reliance meant survival. As he worked to clean the blood from her face, she stirred slightly. Her good eye opened again, watching him with a mixture of wariness and wonder. "You're safe now," he heard himself say, though he knew it might be a lie. Whatever trouble had driven her here, beaten and half dead, wouldn't simply disappear because she'd found shelter. But for now, in this moment, she was safe. He would make sure of that. The sun was setting by the time he'd finished tending her visible wounds. She'd passed out somewhere during the process, a mercy given the pain she must have been in. He covered her with a second blanket and stepped back, suddenly aware of how his ordered world had shifted in the space of an afternoon. Tomorrow there would be questions. Tomorrow there would be decisions to make. But tonight, there was only a battered woman sleeping in his bed and the knowledge that, despite all his promises to himself, Harland McCoy had once again chosen to step between violence and its victim. He pulled his single chair near the bed and settled in to watch over her through the night. The cabin grew dark around them, lit only by the dying embers in the fireplace. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and bringing with it the scent of approaching rain. As the first drops began to fall, Harland touched the scar on his face and wondered what price he would pay this time for his inability to turn away from suffering. But deep down, in a part of himself he rarely acknowledged, he felt something that had been missing for years. Purpose. For better or worse, he had purpose again. The morning light filtered through the cabin's single window, painting geometric patterns on the rough wooden floor. Harland hadn't slept. He'd spent the night in his chair, watching the rise and fall of her breathing, alert for any change that might signal a turn for the worse. Twice she'd cried out in her sleep, words unintelligible, but weighted with fear. And he'd found himself leaning forward, though he didn't know what comfort a stranger could offer. She woke as the first rays touched her face, her good eye opening slowly, confusion giving way to alarm as she took in the unfamiliar surroundings. Her body tensed, ready to flee despite its battered state, until her gaze found him sitting quietly in his chair. "You're safe," he said, the same words he'd spoken yesterday, hoping repetition might make them true. She studied him for a long moment, taking in his size, the scar, the careful distance he maintained even while watching over her. Then she tried to sit up, gasping as the movement sent pain shooting through her ribs. "Don't," Harland said, rising from his chair but not approaching. "You've got broken ribs. Maybe worse. Moving will only make it harder to heal." She settled back against the pillow, her face pale beneath the bruises. "Who are you?" "Harland McCoy. This is my ranch." She paused, as if weighing how much truth to share. Sarah Winters." The name came out carefully, and he suspected it might not be the one she was born with. But then, people came west to escape their names all the time. He moved to the stove, busying himself with building up the fire. "There's water here beside the bed, food when you can manage it. Privy's out back when you're able. But for now." He gestured to a chamber pot he'd placed discreetly behind a curtain. "Why?" she asked, her voice stronger now. "Why help me? You don't know me." Harland kept his back to her, focusing on the coffee pot. "Didn't seem right, letting you die on my porch." Most men would have. He thought about that, about the truth of it. Most men would have kept their distance, protected their peace. Most men were smarter than him. "I'm not most men," he said finally. The coffee began to percolate, filling the cabin with its bitter aroma. He poured 2 cups, adding a generous amount of sugar to hers without asking. She needed the strength. When he turned back, she was watching him with that same careful assessment. "You live alone out here," she said. It wasn't a question. "I do, by choice." He set her cup on the small table beside the bed, within reach but requiring no contact. "By choice." She took the cup with trembling hands, wrapping her fingers around its warmth. The first sip made her close her eyes, and something in her face softened. "It's good, thank you." They drank in silence for a while. The only sounds the crackle of the fire and the distant lowing of cattle. Harland could feel questions building between them like storm clouds, but he'd learned patience in his years of solitude. Finally, she spoke. "I was a cook for a group of settlers heading to Oregon." Her voice was steady, but her knuckles were white around the cup. "The Thompson party. Maybe you heard of them." He shook his head. 15 families. Good people. Mostly. Farmers looking for fresh land. I hired on in independence. Told them I could cook for the whole group. Keep them fed on the trail. A bitter smile touched her split lip. "I was good at it, too. 3 meals a day for 60 people. Cooked over open fires in rain or shine." Harland waited, knowing the story would come in its own time. "There was a man, Josiah Boonhart. He ran supplies to the wagon trains, selling goods at twice what they were worth. But people paid because what choice did they have? 500 miles from nowhere." She set down her cup carefully, as if it might shatter from the force of her memories. "He took a liking to me. Said a woman like me shouldn't be slaving over cook fires. Said he could set me up nice in his trading post." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. "I turned him down, politely at first, then less so when he wouldn't take no for an answer. The wagon master, Mr. Thompson, he told Boonhart to leave me be, for a while. That worked." She touched her swollen eye gingerly. "Then 3 days ago, Boonhart showed up at our camp with 4 men, said I owed him for the disrespect, said I'd cost him face in front of the other traders." Harland's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "They waited until most of the men were out hunting. Came into the cook tent where I was preparing supper. I fought." Her voice carried a note of pride despite everything. "Caught one of them with a pan of hot grease, but 5 against 1. She trailed off, her good eye focusing on something beyond the cabin walls. "The Thompson party?" Harland asked quietly. "They tried to stop it. Mrs. Thompson, she came at them with a rifle. But Boonhart, he said I was his property. Said I'd signed a contract." Her laugh was bitter. "Never signed anything with that man, but he had papers, official looking, and he had guns." She fell silent for a long moment, then continued in a voice barely above a whisper. "They put me on a horse, tied my hands, but I grew up on horses. Mr. McCoy. When we made camp that first night, when they were drunk on their victory, I worked the knots loose, stole away in the darkness. I've been running for 2 days." "They'll come looking," Harland said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." He stood, pacing to the window. The morning stretched peaceful and empty, but he knew how quickly that could change. This Boonhart, he the type to give up? "He's the type who'd burn down half of Wyoming before admitting defeat." She shifted slightly, wincing. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have come here. I'll leave as soon as I can walk." You'll leave when you're healed, Harlan said firmly. Not before. She studied him again with that careful gaze. You're not afraid of them. I'm afraid of lots of things, he admitted. But I learned a long time ago that being afraid doesn't change what needs doing. He moved away from the window, collecting the empty cups. As he did, his sleeve pulled back, revealing old scars on his forearms. She noticed, her eye tracking the marks, but didn't comment. I need to tend the stock, he said. You rest. There's bread in that box, jerky in the jar beside it. Don't try to get up alone. You call if you need anything. Mr. McCoy, she said as he reached for the door. He paused, looking back. Why do you really live alone out here? He considered the question, the weight of it. Same reason you gave a false name, he said finally. Sometimes the past is best left buried. Understanding flickered in her eye, and she nodded slowly. Outside, the morning air was crisp and clean. Harlan breathed deeply, trying to clear his head of the complications that had walked into his life on unsteady feet. He went about his chores mechanically, but his mind kept returning to the cabin, to the woman lying broken but not broken in his bed. She reminded him of a Mustang he'd once tried to gentle, all fire and fear and fierce independence. That horse had eventually learned to trust him, but it had taken months of patient work. He wondered if Sarah Winters, or whatever her real name was, would stay long enough for trust to grow, or if she'd bolt the moment her body allowed it. The cattle needed moving to fresh pasture, a task that normally consumed his full attention. But today he found himself looking over his shoulder, scanning the horizon for dust clouds that might signal approaching riders. By midday, he'd checked his rifle twice and made sure his ammunition was within easy reach. When he returned to the cabin for lunch, she was sleeping again. He moved quietly, preparing a simple meal, but she woke as he was slicing bread. I'm not used to sleeping so much, she said, a note of frustration in her voice. Body needs it to heal. He set the food within her reach. You eat what you can. Build your strength back. She managed a few bites of bread, a small piece of jerky. It wasn't much, but it was progress. As she ate, he noticed her watching him, questions forming and dissolving behind her eye. You want to ask something, he observed. She hesitated. Then, that scar, and the ones on your arms. You've seen violence. I have. Given or received? Both. She nodded as if this confirmed something. Yet you took me in. Maybe because of the scars, not despite them. He hadn't meant to say that, but the words hung between them now, weighted with truth. The afternoon passed quietly. She dozed intermittently while he worked on repairing tech at the table, the familiar task soothing in its simplicity. Sometimes she would wake and they would talk, careful conversations about safe things, the weather, the cattle, the best way to make cornbread over an open fire. But as evening approached, a tension crept into the cabin. They both knew that if Boonhart was tracking her, he'd likely have picked up her trail by now. The question was how fast he could follow it and how many men he'd bring. Harlan made a decision. I need to go to town tomorrow, he said. Talk to the sheriff. Let him know what happened. Maybe he can do something. Sarah's bitter laugh told him what she thought of that possibility. Boonhart's got money. Money buys a lot of law out here. Maybe, but Sheriff Coleman's decent enough. Worth trying. She fell quiet. Then, you believe me about what happened? Harlan looked at her, at the bruises and breaks that told their own story. I believe you. Something shifted in her face then, a easing of tension he hadn't even realized was there. Thank you, she whispered. As night fell, he prepared to take up his vigil in the chair again, but she stopped him. You need sleep too, she said. You can't protect anyone if you're dead on your feet. I'll be fine. Please. Her voice carried a weight that made him pause. I've brought enough trouble to your door. Don't add exhaustion to it. I'll wake you if anything happens. Against his better judgment, Harlan spread a bedroll near the fire, but sleep eluded him for a long time. He lay there listening to her breathing, to the night sounds outside, to the voice in his head that whispered of approaching danger. When he finally dozed, his dreams were full of Phoenix, of 3 men and a woman's scream and the weight of a gun in his hand. But when he woke in the gray pre-dawn, Sarah Winters was watching him from the bed, her good eye reflecting the dying embers of the fire. "Bad dreams?" she asked softly. "Old ones." "I have those too." They looked at each other across the dim cabin, 2 damaged souls recognizing something familiar in the other. Then Harlan rose and built up the fire, and another day began in his no longer solitary world. Neither of them spoke of the understanding that had passed between them in that pre-dawn moment. But it was there, fragile as new ice, a connection neither had sought but both perhaps needed. The question now was whether they'd have time to explore it before Josiah Boonhart came calling. The dust from Harlan's departure still hung in the morning air when the first whispers reached Willow Creek. By the time his wagon rolled down Main Street, half the town seemed to know that the solitary giant had a woman at his ranch. How word traveled so fast across 15 miles of empty prairie was one of those mysteries of frontier life. But travel it did, twisted and embellished with each telling. Pearl Hawthorne stood in the doorway of the Silver Dollar Saloon, her sharp eyes tracking Harlan's progress toward the general store. At 43, Pearl had run the establishment for near a decade, and little happened in Willow Creek without her knowledge. She'd built her empire on information as much as whiskey, and this development was the most interesting news to hit town in months. "Martha," she called to one of her girls, not taking her eyes off Harlan's broad back. "Go find out what Henley knows, casual-like." Inside the general store, Martha Henley's hands trembled more than usual as she gathered Harlan's supplies. "The usual, Mr. McCoy?" she asked, her voice pitched higher than normal. "And some medical supplies," Harlan said quietly. "Bandages, laudanum if you have it. Witch hazel." Martha's eyes widened. She glanced toward the window where she knew at least 3 townspeople were pretending not to watch. "Someone heard out at your place. Just need supplies. Mrs. Henley." But the damage was done. By the time Harlan loaded his wagon, the story had grown. A woman, injured, mysteriously appeared at the McCoy Ranch. The giant who'd killed 3 men in Phoenix was harboring someone. But who and why? Sheriff Red Coleman heard the talk from his desk at the jail, his weathered face creasing with concern. At 58, Red had been keeping law in Willow Creek for 12 years, and he'd made it his business to know everyone in his jurisdiction. Harlan McCoy had been a puzzle from the day he'd arrived, a man clearly running from something but who'd caused no trouble in the 3 years since. Red stood, adjusting his gun belt, and stepped out onto the boardwalk just as Harlan tied his horses in front of the jail. Their eyes met, and Red saw something in the bigger man's face that made his lawman's instincts prickle. "McCoy," he said by way of greeting. "Heard you might have some trouble." "News travels fast." Harlan climbed the steps, having to duck slightly under the jail's doorframe. "Can we talk inside?" Red led him into the small office, closing the door against curious ears. He settled behind his desk, studying Harlan's scarred face. "What's the story?" Harlan told it straight. No embellishment. A woman, beaten near to death, seeking shelter. Claims of false contracts and violent men. The name Josiah Boonhart, which made Red's eyes narrow with recognition. "Boonhart," Red repeated when Harlan finished. "He's been working the wagon trains for 2 years now. There've been complaints, price gouging, intimidation, but nothing I could prove, and he's careful to do most of his business outside my jurisdiction." "What about the woman's claim that he tried to take her by force?" Red sighed, rubbing his graying beard. "It's her word against his, and if he's got papers—" He held up a hand at Harlan's expression. "I'm not saying I don't believe her. I'm saying what a judge would say. Boonhart's got money, connections. He brings business to the town. So you'll do nothing. I didn't say that. Red leaned forward. I'll ride out to the trading post, ask some questions, maybe put the fear of law into him, but McCoy, he paused, choosing his words carefully. You've kept clear of trouble since Phoenix. That's good. Don't let this woman drag you back into violence. Harlan's jaw tightened. I'm not looking for violence. Maybe not, but it has a way of finding you, doesn't it? Red's tone was not unkind. I looked into what happened in Phoenix. 3 dead men, all with records of violence. Witnesses who disappeared. You walking free on self-defense. It paints a picture of a man who attracts trouble. Or a man who doesn't walk away when he should, Harlan said quietly. Red nodded slowly. That too, just be careful. Boonhart runs with rough men. If he comes calling, send someone for me. Don't try to handle it alone. Harlan stood to leave, but Red's voice stopped him at the door. The woman, what's her name? Sarah Winters. Red made a note. I'll ask around, see if anyone knows her from the wagon trains. Might help her case if we can find witnesses. Back on the street, Harlan could feel the weight of watching eyes. Pearl Hawthorne had emerged from the saloon and was making her way toward him with the determined gait of a woman on a mission. He tried to sidestep, but she intercepted him at his wagon. Mr. McCoy, she said, her voice carrying that mix of honey and steel that had made her successful in a rough business. I hear you've taken in a visitor. My business is my own, Mrs. Hawthorne. Of course it is. She smiled, but her eyes remained calculating. Just thought you should know. Boonhart was in town 2 nights ago, drinking heavy and talking loud about some property that went missing. Said he'd pay well for information about a dark-haired woman, about this tall. She held her hand at approximately Sarah's height. Harlan's expression didn't change, but Pearl caught the subtle tension in his shoulders. Thought you should know, she repeated. Also thought you should know that several of my girls heard him talking. If your visitor needs witnesses to his character, well, let's say working women hear things that might be useful. Why would you help? Pearl's smile turned genuine for just a moment. Because I've been where she is, Mr. McCoy. Not exactly the same, but close enough. And because Boonhart's been eyeing my establishment like he wants to add it to his empire. Having him taken down a peg wouldn't hurt my feelings none. She swept back toward the saloon, leaving Harlan to digest this unexpected alliance. He finished loading his supplies, aware that his simple trip to town had become something more. The secret was out. Sarah's presence at his ranch would be common knowledge by nightfall. The ride back seemed longer than usual, his thoughts heavy with implications. Red Coleman would do what he could, but Harlan knew the limitations of frontier law, and Pearl's information confirmed what he'd suspected. Boonhart wouldn't give up easily. As his ranch came into view, Harlan noticed something that made him pull up sharp. Fresh horse tracks crossed his property line, leading toward the cabin before veering off. Someone had been here while he was gone. His hand moved instinctively to his rifle. But the cabin stood undisturbed, smoke still rising from the chimney. He approached cautiously, every sense alert. The door was still barred from the inside, a good sign. He knocked, called out his name. It's all right, Sarah's voice came through the door. They're gone. She let him in, and he could see the strain in her face. 2 riders, she said before he could ask. Came up slow, looking at the cabin. I stayed away from the windows like you said. They circled once, then headed back toward town. Scouts, Harlan said grimly, testing to see if you're here. I'm sorry. Her voice was small. I've brought them to your door. They'd have come anyway, once word got out. He set down the supplies, noting how she watched his movements with a mixture of wariness and something else. Trust, maybe, growing like a seedling in rocky soil. As he unpacked the medical supplies, he told her about his conversations with Red and Pearl. She listened quietly, her expression thoughtful. Pearl Hawthorne, she murmured. I've heard of her. They say she's tough but fair. Seems she's no friend to Boonhart. He's the type who makes enemies easy. Sarah shifted, wincing slightly. But allies are good. We'll need them. Harland noticed the we, but didn't comment. Instead, he said, Sheriff's going to look for witnesses from your wagon train. Might help if you could remember names, specific incidents. For the next hour, as afternoon shadows lengthened, Sarah recounted details, names of families who'd witnessed Boonhart's unwanted advances, dates and places where he'd pressed his suit despite refusal, the circumstances of the forged contract he claimed to have. Mrs. Thompson, Adelaide Thompson, she stood up to him more than once. Sarah recalled, and there was a young man, Daniel Morrison. He wanted to court me proper-like. Boonhart threatened him, said he'd make sure no wagon train would hire him if he didn't back off. Harland made notes in his careful hand, building a case that might stand up in court if it came to that. But both of them knew it might never reach a judge. Frontier justice often played out far from any courtroom. As evening approached, Harland prepared supper. Sarah insisted on helping despite her injuries, peeling potatoes while sitting at the table. There was something domestic about the scene that might have been comfortable if not for the rifle propped within easy reach, and the way both of them tensed at every sound from outside. "You're different than I expected," Sarah said suddenly. Harland glanced at her. "How so?" "When I first saw you, I thought—" She paused, choosing words. "You're so large, and that scar, I thought you'd be harsh, cold, but you're gentle, careful. Even when you were tending my wounds, your hands were—" She trailed off, color rising in her cheeks. "I learned a long time ago that strength without control is just destruction," Harland said quietly. "Had to learn it the hard way. In Phoenix." He nodded, but didn't elaborate. Some stories weren't ready to be told. They ate in companionable silence as darkness settled over the ranch. Harland found himself oddly aware of her presence, the way she held her fork, the careful movements that spoke of lingering pain, the determination in the set of her jaw. It had been so long since he'd shared a meal with another person that he'd forgotten the small intimacies of it. After supper, he checked the windows, barred the door, made his usual preparations for night. But there was nothing usual about having someone else in his space, someone whose safety had somehow become his responsibility. "I'll take the chair again," he said. "No." Sarah's voice was firm. "You need proper rest if trouble's coming. I'm healing. I can sit up for a while. Keep watch. We'll take turns." It made sense, though Harland's protective instincts rebelled at the thought of her sitting vulnerable in the darkness. But she was right. Exhaustion would serve no one. 2 hours each, he compromised. "You wake me at the slightest sound." She nodded, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement that they were in this together now, for better or worse. Whatever Josiah Boonhart had started, they would face it as allies, if not yet friends. As Harland settled onto his bedroll, he reflected on how quickly his ordered world had changed. 3 days ago, he'd been alone, safe in his isolation. Now he had a battered woman under his protection, the town buzzing with gossip, and trouble riding toward him with spurs on. But underneath the worry, underneath the familiar dread of approaching violence, something else stirred. For the first time in 3 years, Harland McCoy felt truly alive. The cost of that feeling remained to be seen, but for tonight, with Sarah keeping watch and the fire crackling low, it was almost enough. The 4th night brought a break in the tension, though neither of them trusted it. Sarah's bruises had faded from purple to yellow-green, and she could move without gasping. They'd fallen into a rhythm of sorts, shared meals, careful conversation, and the constant vigilance of those who knew trouble was coming but not when. It was after supper, as Harland cleaned his rifle for the 3rd time that day, that Sarah finally asked the question that had hung between them like smoke. "Phoenix, she said simply. "Will you tell me?" Harlan's hand stilled on the weapon. He'd known this moment would come, had seen it building in her eyes each time she noticed his scars, or the way he moved through violence preparations with practiced ease. He set the rifle aside and stared into the fire. "I went there to start over," he began, his voice low. "Had some money saved from years of working cattle drives. Thought I'd try my hand at running freight, maybe build something steady." He paused, gathering words like scattered cards. "There was a woman, Maria Delgado. She ran a boarding house where I took a room. Kind woman, fed every stray dog and hungry child that came to her door." Sarah shifted in her chair but didn't speak, sensing the weight of what was coming. 3 men decided she owed them protection money. When she couldn't pay, they decided to take it in trade. His jaw tightened at the memory. "I was coming back from the freight office when I heard her screaming." The fire popped, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Harlan's hand unconsciously moved to the scar on his face. "I tried talking first, told them to leave her be. They laughed. One of them, the leader, said I should mind my business if I knew what was good for me. Had a knife, liked waving it around." He touched the scar again. "Gave me this when I stepped between him and Maria." "But you didn't back down." "No." The word came out flat. "When they saw blood didn't stop me. They went for their guns. I was faster." He looked at his hands, remembering. 3 shots, 3 men dead. Whole thing took maybe 10 seconds. Sarah waited, knowing there was more. "Maria was hurt, terrified. I tried to help her, but she ran. By the time the law came, it was just me and 3 corpses. The knife man was someone important, brother to a city councilman. There were those who wanted to see me hang, protection money or no." "But you were defending her." Harlan's smile was bitter. "That's what my lawyer argued. Self-defense, defense of another. The jury agreed, barely, but Maria never came to testify. Some said she was scared. Others said she'd been paid to disappear. Either way, I was the man who'd killed 3 people in the street. Phoenix made it clear I wasn't welcome." "So you came here." "So I came here." He met her eyes across the firelight. "Built this place, board by board. Kept my head down, my distance up. Figured if I stayed away from people, I'd stay away from the kind of trouble that ends with blood in the street." Sarah was quiet for a long moment. Then she rose, moving carefully to protect her healing ribs, and added a log to the fire. "Maria was a fool," she said quietly, "running from the man who saved her. She was scared. I don't blame her. I'm scared too." She turned to face him, her eyes reflecting the flames. "But I'm not running, not from you." Something shifted in the space between them, a recognition of shared damage and tentative trust, before either could explore it further. The sound of approaching horses shattered the moment. Harlan was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. 2 riders, he said, ear cocked to the window. Maybe 3. Sarah grabbed the pistol he'd been teaching her to use, checking the chambers with steady hands. The fear was there in her eyes, but overlaid with determination. "Sarah, Sarah, honey, you in there?" The voice from outside was smooth as oil, with an undertone that made skin crawl. "It's Josiah. Just want to talk. Clear up this misunderstanding." Harlan looked at Sarah, saw her face pale, but her grip remained steady on the pistol. He moved to the window, keeping to the shadows. "State your business, Boonhart." Harlan called out. There was a pause. "Well now, that's not very neighborly. I'm looking for my employee. Someone who broke a legal contract and stole from me to boot." "No one here but me," Harlan lied smoothly. "That's so funny. Heard different in town. Heard the Hermit of Willow Creek had taken in a visitor, a woman visitor." Boonhart's voice hardened. "I've got legal papers. Mister, you're harboring a fugitive. Show them to the sheriff. He'll be interested in your definition of legal." Another pause, longer this time. When Boonhart spoke again, his friendly mask had slipped. You don't know who you're dealing with. McCoy? Yeah, I know your name. Know your history, too. The killer from Phoenix. Hiding out here playing rancher. You really want to add harboring criminals to your record? Sarah started to speak, but Harland held up a hand for silence. I said there's no one here. Now get off my land before I help you off. Big talk from one man. I've got friends, McCoy. Lots of them. You can't watch every direction forever. Maybe not, but I can watch the direction you're in right now, and my rifle's got an opinion about trespassers in the dark. There was murmured conversation outside, too low to make out. Then Boonhart's voice came again. Forced, casual. Have it your way, but this isn't over. That woman owes me, and I collect my debts, one way or another. The sound of horses moving away faded slowly into the night. Harland stayed at the window, watching, until he was certain they were gone. Only then did he lower the rifle. Sarah sank into her chair, the pistol trembling in her hands now that the immediate danger had passed. He won't stop, she whispered. He's like a dog with a bone when he thinks someone's wronged him. Then we'll be ready when he comes back. Harland barred the door, checked the other window. You did good, stayed calm. I've had practice being afraid. She set the pistol aside, rubbing her face. In the cook tent, when they came for me, I fought because I knew what giving up meant, but I never thought I'd have to keep fighting. Harland moved to the stove, putting coffee on. It would be a long night. Sometimes the fighting doesn't end when we want it to, he said. Sometimes it follows us no matter how far we run. Is that what Phoenix taught you? Phoenix taught me that doing right doesn't always look right to others, that good intentions can lead to blood just as easy as bad ones. He poured 2 cups, the familiar ritual grounding. But it also taught me that sometimes you can't walk away. Sometimes standing your ground is the only choice that lets you live with yourself after. Sarah accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warmth. When I was little, she said softly, my grandmother used to tell me stories about warriors. Not the killing kind, but the protecting kind. She said real strength was knowing when to fight and when to bend. She looked up at him. I think you would have liked her. Your real name isn't Sarah Winters, is it? She smiled slightly. Sarah is real. Winters. That came from looking out at the snow when I was running. Seemed fitting, cold, clean, covering up what came before. What should I call you? She considered. Sarah's good. I've been her long enough now that it feels true. A pause. My grandmother called me Little Sparrow. Said I was always flitting about, never staying still. Not much sparrow left in you now. No, she agreed. Sparrows are prey. I'm done being prey. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the coffee and fire warmth pushing back the darkness. Outside, an owl called, its voice carrying across the empty prairie. Normal night sounds, but both of them listened with sharpened attention. I've been thinking, Sarah said eventually, about what happens after. If Boonhart backs off or the law actually does something, I can't go back to the wagon trains. Word will have spread. No one will hire a woman who brings that kind of trouble. Harland studied her profile in the firelight. You could stay. The words hung between them, surprising them both. Sarah turned to look at him fully. Stay. Ranch could use a cook who knows what she's doing. And you're good with the animals. I've seen you with the horses. Room and board and wages fair for the work. Is that all? Her voice was carefully neutral. For now, he said honestly. Rest we figure out as we go. She nodded slowly. I'd like that. Having somewhere to belong again. Her smile was small but genuine. Though you might regret it when you taste my biscuits. I'm better with stew than baking. My biscuits could shoe horses, so anything's an improvement. It was the first time she'd heard him make anything close to a joke, and her surprised laugh filled the cabin like music. For a moment, the weight of Boonhart's threats faded, and they were just 2 people sharing coffee and conversation by firelight. But reality returned with the wind rattling the windows. They took up their watch positions, alternating through the night hours, each hyper-aware of every sound. When dawn finally came without incident, they were both exhausted but oddly exhilarated. "He's planning something," Sarah said as morning sun painted the cabin gold. "The Josiah Boonhart I know doesn't make threats and then disappear." "Let him plan." Harlan checked his ammunition, counted his supplies. "We've got advantages he doesn't know about. Sheriff Coleman's no friend to bullies, and Pearl Hawthorne seems inclined to help. Plus," he looked at her steadily, "you're not the same woman who ran from his camp. You're stronger now." "Because of you." "No, the strength was always there. You just needed time to find it again." Sarah stood, stretching carefully. Her movements were still cautious, but no longer pained. "I should learn to shoot better. And ride, really ride, not just sit a horse." "We'll start today." "And I want to go to town with you next time. Face them all. Let them see I'm not hiding." Harlan frowned. "That might not be wise." "Hiding makes me look guilty. I need witnesses to see I'm not some criminal or woman of loose morals. I need them to see Boonhart for what he is when he comes after me in public." She had a point, though Harlan's protective instincts rebelled at the thought of exposing her to the town's judgment. But Sarah wasn't his to protect, not really. She was choosing to stand and fight, and he could either support that or get out of her way. "All right," he said, "but we go prepared, and we watch each other's backs." "Partners." She held out her hand. He took it, her grip firm despite the healing damage. "Partners." As they shook hands, sealing an alliance born of necessity but growing into something more. Neither noticed the riders watching from the distant ridge, Boonhart's men, patient as wolves, waiting for their moment. The real fight was yet to come, but in that morning light, with trust growing between them like a bridge over dark water. Sarah and Harlan had already won something valuable. They were no longer alone in their struggles, no longer isolated in their pain. And sometimes, in the harsh reality of frontier life, that partnership was the difference between surviving and living. The storm rolled in from the northwest just after sunset, bringing with it the smell of rain and electricity. Thunder rumbled across the prairie like distant cannon fire, and lightning illuminated the landscape in brief, stark moments of clarity. Harlan stood on the porch, watching the approaching weather with the practiced eye of a man who'd learned to read nature's moods. "It'll be a big one," he said as Sarah joined him, careful to stay back from the edge where rain was beginning to fall in heavy sheets. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I've always loved storms. Even as a child, when others ran inside, I wanted to stand and watch." "My mother was the same," Harlan said, surprising himself with the admission. He rarely spoke of family. "Said storms were God's way of reminding us how small we really are." They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the rain transform the dusty ground into mud. Listening to it drum against the roof, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees in as many minutes, bringing relief from the day's heat. "Come inside," Harlan said eventually. "You're still healing. Can't afford to catch a chill?" But as they turned to enter the cabin, a flicker of movement caught his eye. There, at the edge of his property where the trail met his land, a light bobbed and swayed. Then it vanished, swallowed by the darkness and rain. "Did you see that?" Sarah whispered, her body tensing. "I saw it." Harlan guided her inside, his mind already calculating. One rider, maybe two, using the storm as cover to scout his defenses. "Bar the door behind me." "Where are you going?" He took his rifle from its place by the door, checked his ammunition, to make sure they know we're watching. "In this storm, Harlan, no. I know this land like my own hands. They don't." He pulled on his oilcloth coat. "I won't go far. Just enough to let them know sneaking around in the dark isn't as clever as they think." Sarah wanted to protest further. He could see it in her eyes, but she'd learned to trust his judgment in matters of defense. Be careful, she said instead. I'll keep watch from the window. Harlan slipped out into the storm, immediately drenched despite his coat. The rain came down in sheets, turning the world into a blur of water and shadows, but he knew every rock, every dip in the ground, every fence post. He moved through the darkness like a ghost, rifle ready but not raised. Thunder crashed overhead, the sound enormous in the night. In the brief illumination of lightning that followed, he saw them, 2 riders, stopped just inside his property line, their horses nervous in the storm. They were looking toward his cabin, probably trying to see through the windows. Count the occupants. Harlan circled wide, using the storm to mask his approach. When he was close enough to be heard over the rain, he called out, "You boys lost." Both riders jerked in their saddles, hands moving toward weapons, but Harlan had positioned himself wisely. They couldn't see him in the darkness, couldn't tell if his rifle was already aimed at them. "Private property," one of them said, trying to sound confident. "We're just passing through. In this storm, at night, on my land." Harlan let his disbelief color his voice. "Turn around and pass through somewhere else, unless you've got business here. In which case, state it." Lightning flashed again, giving him a clear view of their faces. Young men, probably hired guns Boonhart had brought in. Their horses danced nervously, wanting to flee the storm. "We'll be going," the second rider said, apparently the smarter of the 2. "No trouble intended." "Good. And tell Boonhart that sending boys to do reconnaissance in a thunderstorm is a fool's errand. Next time I might not be so conversational." He watched them ride away, waiting until they were well off his property before making his way back to the cabin. Sarah opened the door before he could knock, relief clear on her face. "They're gone," he said, shedding his soaked coat. "Just scouts, testing our alertness." She handed him a towel, her movements efficient. "You're freezing. Sit by the fire while I get you dry clothes." It was such a domestic gesture, so naturally done, that it stopped him for a moment. When was the last time someone had worried about him catching cold? He couldn't remember. As he changed into dry clothes, Sarah busied herself making hot coffee, adding a generous splash of whiskey to his cup. "My grandmother's recipe for storm chill," she said, handing it to him. They settled by the fire, the storm still raging outside, but somehow less threatening now. The cabin felt like a fortress against the darkness, warm and secure. "Tell me about her," Harlan said. "Your grandmother." Sarah smiled, the expression transforming her face. "She was Cherokee, married my grandfather when she was 16, scandalized both their families, but they loved each other fierce, right up until he died in the war." "Which side?" "Confederate. Not for the cause. He didn't own slaves, didn't believe in it. But Tennessee was home, and he felt obligated to defend it." She stared into the fire. "Grandmother never remarried, raised my mother alone, then helped raise me when mother died of fever." Strong woman. The strongest I've ever known. When the government tried to move her off her land, she sat on her porch with my grandfather's rifle and told them they'd have to carry her off dead. Sarah's smile turned bittersweet. "They left her alone. Said one old Indian woman wasn't worth the trouble. What happened to her? Died in her sleep 5 winters ago. I'd already left home. Trying to make my way, got word months later." She touched a small leather pouch at her throat that Harlan hadn't noticed before. "This is all I have of hers. Some herbs, a stone from the creek by her cabin. Silly, maybe." "Not silly," Harlan said firmly. "We carry what matters." Thunder crashed overhead, rattling the windows. Sarah drew her knees up, making herself smaller in the chair. "I used to love storms," she said quietly. "Now they remind me of that night, the thunder covering their footsteps, the lightning showing their faces." "New memories can overlay old ones," Harlan said. "Takes time, but it happens." "Is that what you did after Phoenix?" He considered the question. Some days. Others, the old memories win. But having something else to focus on helps. The ranch, the cattle, the rhythm of days. And now, he met her eyes across the firelight. Now I remember why I stood between Maria and those men in the first place. Some things are worth the risk. She held his gaze for a long moment. Something shifting in the air between them. Then lightning flashed again, breaking the spell, and she looked away. I should learn to track, she said, changing the subject. To read sign like you did tonight. If I'm going to stay here, really stay, I need to be useful beyond cooking and mending. I'll teach you, though you're already useful in ways you don't realize. How so? Harlan gestured around the cabin. Place feels different with you here. Less like a tomb, more like a home. That's no small thing. Color rose in her cheeks, but she smiled. Careful, Mr. McCoy. That almost sounded like sentiment. Must be the whiskey and the coffee. She laughed, the sound bright against the storm's fury. They talked on as the night deepened, sharing stories and silences in equal measure. The storm began to pass, thunder growing distant, rain softening to a steady patter. When Sarah finally dozed off in her chair, exhausted by the day's tensions, Harlan covered her with a blanket and took up his usual watch, but his thoughts were troubled by more than just Boonhart's scouts. He was growing attached to her, not just protective, but genuinely caring about her presence, her thoughts, her laughter. It was dangerous, this softening of his carefully maintained walls. The last time he'd let someone matter, people had died, and he'd been driven from Phoenix like a pariah. But watching her sleep in the firelight, her face peaceful despite everything she'd endured, he couldn't bring himself to rebuild those walls. Maybe some risks were worth taking. Maybe some connections were worth the potential pain. The storm passed entirely just before dawn, leaving the world washed clean. Harlan stepped onto the porch to find the prairie transformed, puddles reflecting the early sky. The air sharp and fresh. In the distance, he could see his cattle emerging from whatever shelter they'd found, ready to graze on the rain-refreshed grass. It's beautiful, Sarah said behind him. She'd woken and joined him, still wrapped in the blanket. Like the world's been made new. Storms always bring change, Harlan agreed. Sometimes for the better. She moved to stand beside him, close enough that he could feel her warmth. I dreamed about my grandmother last night. She was sitting on your porch, smoking her pipe, watching the sunrise. She looked at me and said, "This is a good place. Little sparrow, strong roots grow here." Dreams can be wise. Or wishful. She turned to look up at him. But I'd like to believe this one. I'd like to believe I've found somewhere to belong again. Harlan thought about scouts in the darkness, about Boonhart's threats, about all the violence that might yet come. But he also thought about shared coffee and stories by the fire, about laughter breaking through storm sounds, about the simple comfort of not being alone. You have, he said simply, for as long as you want it. She smiled then, brilliant as the rising sun. Careful, Harlan, a girl might start thinking you're going soft. Must be all this rain, he said, washing away the rough edges. They stood together watching the new day begin, neither speaking of the danger still circling them like wolves. There would be time enough for that. For now, there was this moment, the clean air, the golden light, the fragile peace they'd built together in the heart of the storm. Inside, the fire had burned low, but the cabin still held warmth. They moved through the morning routine together, no longer stepping carefully around each other, but working in easy harmony. When their hands accidentally touched while reaching for the same cup, neither pulled away immediately. Change had come with the storm, subtle but undeniable. They were still teacher and student, protector and protected, two damaged souls helping each other heal. But now they were also something more, something neither quite had words for yet. And in the freshness of the morning, with the world washed new around them, that unnamed something felt like hope. The crack of gunfire split the morning air, followed by the ring of lead on metal. Sarah lowered the rifle, squinting at the target Harland had set up 50 yards away, an old pot hanging from a fence post. She'd managed to hit it twice out of 6 shots, better than yesterday, but still far from the marksmanship that might save her life. "You're jerking the trigger," Harland said from beside her. "Squeeze it gentle, like you're pressing water from a sponge." She nodded, raising the rifle again. These lessons had become part of their daily routine over the past week, along with riding practice and learning to read tracks. Sarah had thrown herself into the training with a determination that both impressed and worried him. This time when she fired, the pot rang clear and true. "Better," he said. "But remember, hitting a target that's standing still in good light is one thing. Most trouble comes fast and in poor conditions. Then let's practice in poor conditions." Sarah's jaw set with that stubbornness he'd come to recognize. "I won't be caught helpless again." They spent the morning working through different scenarios, shooting from a crouch, from behind cover, while moving. Sarah's bruises had faded to yellow shadows, and she moved with growing confidence. When she finally called a halt, her arms trembling from the rifle's weight, she'd improved markedly. "You're pushing hard," Harland observed as they walked back to the cabin. "Not hard enough." She wiped sweat from her forehead. "Every day we wait. Boonhart's planning something. I can feel it." She was right. The scouts had returned twice more, always careful to stay just off his property line. And yesterday in town, Harland had noticed new faces, hard men with tied-down guns who watched him with calculating eyes. Boonhart was gathering forces. After lunch, they worked with the horses. Sarah had taken to riding like she'd been born to it, her natural balance compensating for years of inexperience. Today, Harland taught her to ride bareback, to guide the horse with her knees and weight rather than relying on reins. "If you need to run, really run, saddle time might cost your life," he explained, watching her circle the corral on his gentle mare. "And if you're thrown, better to fall clean than risk being dragged." Sarah nodded, concentrating on maintaining her seat as the mare trotted. Her hair had come loose from its pins, streaming behind her like a dark banner. There was something wild and free in her expression that made Harland's chest tighten. "Now try it with your eyes closed," he called. "What?" "Trust the horse. Feel her movement. Sometimes in the dark or in panic, your eyes will lie to you. Your body knows better." Sarah shot him a skeptical look but closed her eyes. For a moment, she swayed dangerously, then found her balance. The mare continued its steady circuit, and Sarah's face transformed with wonder. "I can feel her breathing," she said. "Feel which leg she'll move next." That's the connection. Once you have that, you and the horse become one creature, harder to stop, harder to predict. She opened her eyes, grinning with accomplishment. But the smile faded as she spotted something over his shoulder. Harland, riders coming. He turned to see 3 figures approaching from the direction of town. But these weren't Boonhart's men. He recognized Sheriff Coleman's distinctive gray hat, and beside him rode Pearl Hawthorne's side saddle on a bay gelding. The third rider was a young man Harland didn't know. Sarah dismounted quickly, smoothing her hair with nervous hands. "Should I go inside?" "No, you wanted to stop hiding. This is a good start." They met the riders in front of the cabin. Red Coleman touched his hat brim. "McCoy, ma'am." "Sheriff," Harland acknowledged. "Mrs. Hawthorne, to what do we owe the visit?" Pearl spoke up, her keen eyes taking in Sarah's appearance, the fading bruises, the determined set of her shoulders, the way she stood close to Harland but not behind him. "We've brought someone you need to meet. This is Daniel Morrison." The young man dismounted awkwardly, clearly more comfortable with books than horses. He was perhaps 25, with earnest brown eyes and ink stains on his fingers. "Miss Sarah, I've been so worried. When you disappeared from the wagon train, we feared the worst." Sarah stepped forward, recognition dawning. "Daniel, but how?" Mrs. Hawthorne found me," he explained. "I've been in Willow Creek for 2 days, trying to work up the courage to come out here, when the sheriff mentioned he was riding this way." Daniel was the Thompson party's record keeper, Red explained. Kept detailed accounts of everything, including certain incidents involving Josiah Boonhart. The young man nodded eagerly, pulling a leather journal from his saddlebag. "I wrote it all down. Every time he bothered you, every threat he made. Mr. Thompson said to keep records in case we needed them for the law." Sarah's eyes filled with tears. She quickly blinked away. "You came all this way to help me." Daniel's face reddened. "Of course. You are. That is, what Boonhart did was wrong. Everyone in the wagon party knew it." Pearl dismounted with surprising grace for a woman her age. "I've arranged for Daniel to stay in town. He's prepared to testify before a judge about what he witnessed. Combined with testimonies from my girls about Boonhart's character, we might have enough to bring formal charges." "Might?" Harlan's voice was skeptical. Red sighed. "Boonhart's hired himself a lawyer from Denver, slick fellow named Aldrich. He's already filing papers claiming Miss Winters here violated a legal contract, without the original document to examine." "He's lying," Sarah said flatly. "I never signed anything." "I believe you," Red said. "But believing and proving are different animals. Still, with Morrison's testimony and Mrs. Hawthorne's witnesses, we can make things uncomfortable for Boonhart. Maybe uncomfortable enough that he decides to cut his losses." Harlan doubted that, but kept his opinion to himself. Men like Boonhart didn't back down when challenged. They doubled down. "Would you like to come in?" Sarah offered. "I could make coffee." Pearl smiled. "That's kind of you, dear, but we should get back before dark. I just wanted to see for myself that you were well. You are well, aren't you?" There was something maternal in the saloon owner's tone that seemed to surprise everyone, including Pearl herself. Sarah nodded slowly. "I'm healing, learning to defend myself." "Good. A woman needs to know her own strength." Pearl's gaze moved to Harlan. "And it appears you've found yourself a capable teacher." "Mr. McCoy has been very kind," Sarah said carefully. Pearl's knowing smile suggested she saw more than Sarah intended to reveal. "I'm sure he has. Well, we'll leave you to your evening. But Sarah, when you're ready to come to town, stop by the Silver Dollar. I might have a business proposition for you." After the visitors left, Sarah stood staring down the trail long after their dust had settled. "Daniel came all this way," she murmured. "He barely knew me on the wagon train. We spoke maybe a dozen times." "He's sweet on you," Harlan said bluntly. Sarah turned to him. Studying his face, "Does that bother you?" The question hung between them like a challenge. Harlan wanted to deny it, to maintain the careful distance he'd cultivated. But looking at her standing there, strong and vulnerable at once, he found only truth. "Yes." Her eyes widened slightly at the admission. "Why?" "You know why." She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes. "I need to hear you say it." "Because I've gotten used to you being here. Because the cabin feels empty when you're not in it. Because—" He stopped, frustrated by the inadequacy of words. "Because you care about me," she finished softly. "The way I care about you." "Sarah." "No." She pressed fingers to his lips, silencing him. "Don't tell me why it's a bad idea. Don't talk about Phoenix or danger or any of that, just for this moment. Let it be what it is." He caught her hand, held it against his chest where his heart beat too fast. "And what is it?" "I don't know yet, but something that makes me want to stay and fight instead of run. Something that makes me feel brave." "You are brave, with or without me." "Maybe, but I'm braver with you." They stood there in the fading afternoon light, her hand pressed to his heart, his scarred face bent toward hers. The moment stretched, fragile and precious. until the sound of a distant gunshot shattered it. Both of them turned toward the sound, instantly alert. Another shot followed, then silence. "Target practice," Sarah suggested hopefully. Wrong direction. That came from the Anders place. Harlan's neighbor to the east, 5 miles away. "Stay here. Bar the door." "Harlan." "Please." He was already moving toward his horse. "If there's trouble, I need to know you're safe." She wanted to argue. He could see it, but she nodded. "Be careful." He saddled quickly and rode hard toward the Anders homestead. The family, Joe, his wife Emma, and their 2 young boys were good people, quiet and hardworking, the kind who minded their own business and expected others to do the same. What he found made his blood run cold. The Anders family stood in their yard, surrounded by 6 mounted men. Joe had a shotgun, but it was pointed at the ground. Emma clutched her boys close, the younger one crying, and there, mounted on a black stallion like some frontier prince, sat Josiah Boonhart. "Ah, McCoy," Boonhart called out as Harlan approached. "Just in time. I was explaining to Mr. Anders here about the dangers of harboring fugitives." "We haven't harbored anyone," Joe protested. "We don't even know what you're talking about." "Maybe not yet," Boonhart agreed. "But your neighbor has, and neighbors help neighbors out here. Don't they might be tempted to help hide someone, might be tempted to lie to protect a friend." Harlan pulled up just outside the circle of riders. "This is harassment. Boonhart, these people have nothing to do with your business." "Everything's my business when it comes to what's mine." Boonhart's smile was cold. "Just having a friendly chat, making sure everyone understands the situation, how helping criminals can be unhealthy." Little Emma Anders whimpered, and her mother pulled her closer. "You've made your point," Harlan said evenly. "Now move along." "Oh, I'll move along. But first, let me be clear." Boonhart leaned forward in his saddle. "Anyone who helps that thieving woman, anyone who stands between me and what's mine, will regret it. Their farms might have accidents. Their cattle might get sick. Their children might find the road to school more dangerous than usual." "You threatening children now?" Harlan's voice had gone deadly quiet. "Threatening, no. Just observing how dangerous the frontier can be. All sorts of accidents can happen to folks who don't mind their own business." Harlan's hand moved to his rifle, but Joe Anders spoke up quickly. "We don't want trouble. We've got nothing to do with your dispute." "Smart man." Boonhart touched his hat brim mockingly. "You all have a pleasant evening. And McCoy, tell that woman her time's running out. Law's on my side, and patience isn't my strong suit." They rode off in a cloud of dust, leaving the Anders family shaken and Harlan seething with cold rage. This was escalation, bringing innocent neighbors into the conflict. "I'm sorry," he told Joe. "I never meant for this to touch you." Joe's face was grim. "Not your fault. Men like that make their own rules." He looked at his frightened family. "But I've got to think of them first. You understand?" "I understand." Harlan rode home slowly, his mind churning. Boonhart was applying pressure from all sides now, legal threats, intimidation, involving innocents. The man was building a cage of fear around them. Sarah met him at the door, rifle in hand, relief flooding her face when she saw he was unharmed. He told her what had happened, watched her expression harden with guilt and determination. "I should leave," she said. "Draw him away from here. These people don't deserve to suffer for my troubles." "You leave, he wins, and he'll still make examples of anyone who helped you." "Then what do we do?" Harlan looked out at the darkening sky, where the first stars were beginning to appear. "We stop playing defense. Time to take the fight to him." "How?" "Pearl Hawthorne offered you a business proposition. I think it's time we heard what she has in mind." He turned to face her. "You wanted to stop hiding tomorrow. We ride into town together. Let Boonhart see you're not running. Let the whole town see it." Fear flickered in her eyes, but she nodded. "And if he tries something?" Then we handle it. Together. She moved to him then, wrapped her arms around his waist, pressed her face against his chest. He held her, feeling the tremors that ran through her body, the courage it took for her to stand firm. "No more running," she whispered. "No more running," he agreed. They stood together as darkness fell. Two people who'd found each other across miles of prairie and years of pain. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new challenges. But tonight, they had the warmth of connection, the strength of shared purpose, and the growing certainty that some things were worth any risk. In the distance, a coyote howled, and its pack answered. The sound should have been threatening, but Sarah lifted her head and smiled. "They're calling their family together," she said, "telling them it's time to hunt." Harlan pressed a kiss to her forehead, the first time he'd allowed himself such tenderness. "Then we'd better be ready." "We will be." Her voice carried steel now. "I'm done being prey, remember?" And looking down at her fierce expression, Harlan believed it. Tomorrow, Josiah Boonhart would learn that the woman he'd tried to break had become something far more dangerous than he'd imagined. She'd become someone with something to fight for. The morning sun cast long shadows down Main Street as Harlan and Sarah rode into Willow Creek. She sat straight in her saddle, chin raised, wearing the blue dress she'd mended with careful stitches. The bruises had faded enough that Pearl's gifted face powder covered the last traces. To anyone watching, she looked like a respectable woman coming to town for supplies, not a fugitive in hiding. But everyone was watching. Curtains twitched in windows. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Martha Henley emerged from the general store, feather duster in hand, and froze at the sight of them. The blacksmith paused his hammering. Even the dogs seemed to sense the tension, slinking into alleys rather than investigating the newcomers. "Steady," Harlan murmured, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to Sarah or himself. They tied their horses outside the sheriff's office. A deliberate choice. Let the town see they had nothing to hide, that they came openly in daylight. Red Coleman met them at the door, his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Winters, McCoy, was hoping you'd come by." Inside the office, Daniel Morrison sat nervously in a chair, his journal clutched in his lap. He jumped up when Sarah entered, nearly knocking over his coffee. "Miss Sarah, you look, that is, I'm glad to see you're well." "Thank you for coming forward, Daniel," Sarah said warmly. "It means more than you know." Red gestured for them to sit. "I've been reviewing Morrison's records. They're thorough. Very thorough." He tapped the journal. "According to these entries, Boonhart approached you 17 times over the course of 3 weeks, each time more aggressive than the last." "He didn't like being told no," Sarah said simply. "Few men do, but most accept it eventually." Red leaned back in his chair. "The problem is, Boonhart's lawyer is arguing these were legitimate business negotiations. Says you led him on, made promises." "That's a lie." "I know, but it's a clever lie, without witnesses to the actual conversations." "I was there for some of them," Daniel interjected. "When he cornered her by the cook wagon, when he grabbed her arm at the river crossing." Red nodded. "Good, that's good. But Boonhart's brought in witnesses too. Men willing to swear they saw you accept gifts from him. Heard you make promises." "Bought witnesses," Harlan said flatly. "Probably, but proving that is another matter." Red stood, pacing to the window. "Here's what I propose. We bring this before Judge Watson when he comes through next week. Present our evidence. Let Boonhart present his, let the law sort it out proper." "And until then," Sarah asked. "Until then, you stay visible. Don't hide. Don't run. Show the town you're not afraid." Red turned back to them. "Boonhart's trying to paint you as a woman of loose morals who took advantage of him. Every day you conduct yourself with dignity undermines that story." A commotion outside interrupted him. Through the window, they could see a crowd gathering near the Silver Dollar. Harlan tensed, hand moving instinctively toward his gun. "That'll be Pearl's doing," Red said with a slight smile. She mentioned something about a public demonstration of support. They emerged to find Pearl Hawthorne standing on the saloon's porch like a general reviewing troops. Beside her stood several of her girls and, surprisingly, a number of the town's respectable women, the baker's wife, the schoolteacher, even the minister's stern-faced sister. "Ladies of Willow Creek," Pearl announced in a voice that carried down the street. "We've gathered to discuss a matter of importance to every woman in this town. The question of whether a woman's no means anything in the eyes of certain men." Sarah stopped short, her face paling. "What is she doing?" "Making a statement," Harlan realized. "A powerful one." Pearl continued, her words measured but forceful. "We've all known men who wouldn't take no for an answer. Men who think their wants outweigh our wishes. Men who use money and power to take what isn't freely given." Her eyes found Sarah in the crowd. "Today, we say enough." The minister's sister spoke up, her usually pinched face animated with rare passion. "I've held my tongue for years about the liberties certain traveling merchants take. No more. A woman should be able to work without being pawed at or threatened." Other voices joined in, sharing stories, building momentum, not all about Boonhart, but about the pattern he represented. The crowd grew as more townspeople emerged to listen. Then, like a dark cloud crossing the sun, Josiah Boonhart himself appeared at the end of the street. He rode slowly, flanked by 4 of his men, his black suit immaculate despite the dust. The crowd fell silent as he dismounted in front of the sheriff's office. "Sheriff Coleman," he said, ignoring everyone else. "I understand the woman who stole from me is here. I've come to press charges." Sarah stepped forward before anyone could stop her. "I stole nothing from you, Mr. Boonhart." The silence that followed was absolute. The whole town seemed to hold its breath as Boonhart turned to face her, his eyes cold as winter frost. "Miss Winters." He made her assumed name sound like an insult. "Or whatever your real name is. You took payment for services not rendered. In any court, that's theft. I took nothing from you, ever." "No." Boonhart reached into his coat, producing a leather pouch. "Then how do you explain this found in your abandoned tent at the wagon camp? My money pouch with my initials. J.B.C." Sarah's face went white. "That's not, I never—" "Planted evidence," Harland growled, stepping protectively closer to her. Boonhart's smile was sharp as a blade. "Careful. McCoy. Slander's a serious charge. I have witnesses who saw her with this pouch, saw her take it from my tent." "Bought witnesses. Prove it." Boonhart turned to Red. "Sheriff, I demand you arrest this woman. I have evidence, witnesses, and legal documentation of our agreement." Red stood firm. "I'll need to investigate these claims. The judge will hear the case next week." "Next week," Boonhart's voice rose. "This woman is a flight risk. She's already run once." "I'm not running." Sarah's voice rang clear across the square. "I'm right here, Mr. Boonhart, in full view of everyone. I have nothing to hide." "Nothing to hide," Boonhart laughed, ugly and harsh. "Should I tell them about the offers you made, the promises, how you led me on for weeks, accepted my protection, my gifts?" "Tell them," Sarah said simply. "Tell them everything, but tell the truth this time." The crowd pressed closer, sensing drama. Boonhart's face darkened as he realized the trap any specific claims he made could be contradicted by Daniel's journal, by the wagon train families. "The truth." He stepped closer to Sarah, close enough that Harlan tensed for violence. "The truth is, you're a lying, thieving—" "That's enough." The voice came from an unexpected source. Judge Watson stepped out of the hotel, 2 weeks early for his circuit. The elderly jurist commanded instant respect, his presence turning the street confrontation into something resembling a courtroom. "Judge," Boonhart recovered quickly. "I didn't expect you until—" "My schedule changed," Fortunate, given what I'm witnessing. Watson's keen eyes took in the scene. Mr. Boonhart, are you attempting to try this case in the street? I'm simply pursuing what's mine, Your Honor. What you claim is yours, Watson corrected. Sheriff Coleman, I'll hear this case tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock sharp. Both parties will present their evidence in a proper legal setting, not a street theater. Your Honor, Boonhart's lawyer, a thin man named Aldrich, materialized from the crowd. My client has been more than patient. Your client appears to be intimidating a witness in front of half the town, Watson observed dryly. I suggest you counsel him on proper legal procedures. He turned to Sarah. Miss, do you have representation? I'll stand for her. A voice called out. To everyone's surprise, Thomas Hartwell, the town's semi-retired attorney, pushed through the crowd. Pro bono. About time someone stood up to certain elements in this town. Boonhart's face went dark with rage, but Aldrich whispered urgently in his ear. With visible effort, he controlled himself. Tomorrow, then, we'll settle this properly. His eyes found Sarah again, one way or another. The threat hung in the air as he remounted and rode off, his men following like shadows. The crowd began to disperse, buzzing with excitement and speculation. Pearl descended from her porch, approaching Sarah with something like maternal pride. You did well, standing up to him like that. I was terrified, Sarah admitted quietly. Of course you were. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's acting despite it. Pearl glanced at Harland. You've taught her well. She taught herself, Harland said. I just gave her space to remember who she is. Thomas Hartwell joined them. His elderly face creased with determination. We need to prepare, Miss Winters. I'll need to hear everything. Every detail, no matter how small. They spent the afternoon in Hartwell's dusty office, building their case. Daniel's journal proved invaluable, his meticulous nature having captured dates, times, and exact words. Pearl's girls provided additional statements about Boonhart's character and business practices. Even the minister's sister came forward with her own experiences. As evening approached, Harlan noticed Sarah beginning to wilt. The strain of the day, of being so exposed after weeks of hiding, was taking its toll. We should go, he told Hartwell. She needs rest before tomorrow. Of course. One more thing. Miss Winters. The lawyer peered over his spectacles. Is Sarah Winters your legal name? She hesitated, then shook her head. It's Sarah Little Sparrow. My grandmother's name was Little Sparrow, and I took it when I left home. Little Sparrow, Hartwell made a note. Cherokee. 1/4, my grandmother. Good, that's good. Judge Watson has no patience for men who prey on women, especially women of native blood. He lost a daughter to such violence years ago. As they prepared to leave town, Daniel Morrison caught up with them. Miss Sarah, that is, he fumbled for words, then thrust a small wrapped package at her. From Mrs. Thompson. She wanted you to have it. Sarah unwrapped it carefully, revealing a small silver locket. Inside was a tintype of the Thompson wagon train. All the families gathered together. She was visible at the edge, by her cook wagon, smiling. So you remember, Daniel said, that you had a family on the trail, people who cared what happened to you. Tears ran down Sarah's cheeks as she clutched the locket. Thank you. Thank both of you. The ride home was quiet, both lost in thought. As the ranch came into view, Harlan spoke. You were magnificent today. I was terrified. And magnificent. They're not exclusive. He paused. Whatever happens tomorrow. Don't! Sarah reached across the space between their horses, touched his hand. Don't talk about tomorrow yet. Let's just have tonight. They tended the horses in companionable silence, prepared a simple meal, sat by the fire as they'd done so many evenings before, but there was a weight to this night, an awareness that tomorrow would bring change one way or another. "Harland," Sarah said suddenly, "if things go badly tomorrow, if Watson believes Boonhart—" "He won't." "But if he does, I need you to promise something." She turned to face him fully. "Don't do anything violent. Don't become the man from Phoenix again. Not for me." "Sarah, promise me." Her eyes were fierce. "I won't be the reason you lose yourself again. I won't have that on my conscience." He studied her face, seeing the strength there, the determination. This woman who'd arrived broken and bleeding had become someone formidable. "I promise," he said finally. "No violence unless in immediate defense." "Thank you." She rose, moving to stand before him. "And Harland, whatever happens tomorrow, I need you to know something. These weeks with you, they've given me back myself. You've shown me I don't have to be afraid anymore, that I can stand and face whatever comes. You always had that strength. Maybe, but I'd forgotten it. You helped me remember." She leaned down, pressed a soft kiss to his scarred cheek. "No matter what tomorrow brings, I'll always be grateful for that." She went to bed then, leaving him by the fire with his thoughts. Tomorrow would bring judgment, one way or another, justice or injustice, freedom or flight. But tonight, in this moment, they'd already won something valuable. They'd shown Josiah Boonhart and the entire town that Sarah Little Sparrow was not prey to be hunted. She was a woman who would stand her ground, speak her truth, and face her accuser without flinching. And she wouldn't face him alone. Harland touched his cheek where she'd kissed him, feeling something he hadn't felt since Phoenix. Hope, not just for tomorrow's outcome, but for all the days that might follow. Days where the cabin wouldn't echo with loneliness. Days filled with shared purpose and growing connection. He banked the fire and took up his watch position, rifle across his knees. One more night of vigilance. Then face what came with the dawn. But for the first time in 3 years, Harland McCoy looked forward to tomorrow, whatever it might bring. Because he wouldn't be facing it alone either. The courthouse was packed to capacity, with people standing along the walls and crowding the doorway. Word had spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. The showdown between Josiah Boonhart and the mysterious woman at the McCoy Ranch had captured the town's imagination. Judge Watson sat behind his bench, his weathered face impassive as he surveyed the crowd. "This court will come to order," he announced, his gavel cracking down. "We're here to examine the claims between Mr. Josiah Boonhart and Miss Sarah Little Sparrow, also known as Sarah Winters." Sarah sat at the defendant's table with Thomas Hartwell, her hands folded calmly in her lap. She wore a simple gray dress that Pearl had loaned her, her hair pinned back severely. The effect was one of quiet dignity. Across the aisle, Boonhart lounged in his chair like a cat certain of its prey, his lawyer Aldrich shuffling papers beside him. "Mr. Aldrich," Watson began, "present your case." The thin lawyer stood, adjusting his spectacles. "Your Honor, this is a simple matter of theft and breach of contract. My client, Mr. Boonhart, entered into a business arrangement with the defendant. She accepted payment and then fled, taking with her not only the money advanced to her, but also personal property belonging to Mr. Boonhart." "What was the nature of this business arrangement?" Watson asked. "The defendant agreed to work at Mr. Boonhart's trading post. She was to manage the kitchen and household affairs. Mr. Boonhart, generous man that he is, advanced her 3 months' wages to help her settle debts from her wagon train passage." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she remained silent on Hartwell's whispered advice. "Do you have documentation of this agreement?" Watson inquired. Aldrich produced a paper with a flourish. "Signed and witnessed, Your Honor." Hartwell stood immediately. "We contest the authenticity of that signature. Your Honor, Miss Little Sparrow cannot read or write beyond her own name." "Yet the signature is here," Aldrich countered, "and we have witnesses." He called forward 3 men, rough-looking characters who swore they'd seen Sarah sign the paper. Seen her take money from Boonhart. Their stories were too similar, too rehearsed, but they stuck to them despite Hartwell's cross-examination. Then came the leather pouch, presented as evidence. Found in the defendant's tent, Aldrich stated. Mr. Boonhart's initials clearly visible. The defendant stole this when she fled. The crowd murmured. It looked bad, and Sarah felt the weight of their judgment, but Hartwell merely smiled. Your Honor, the old lawyer said, might I examine this crucial piece of evidence? He took the pouch, studying it carefully. Mr. Boonhart, you say this is yours? It is, Boonhart said confidently. And these are your initials, J.B. Obviously. How curious. Hartwell held the pouch up to the light. Because the stitching on these initials is quite fresh. The leather around them shows no wear, no fading, almost as if they were added recently. Perhaps as recently as 2 days ago. The courtroom stirred. Boonhart's face darkened. Furthermore, Hartwell continued, this particular style of pouch is sold at Henley's general store. Mrs. Henley, are you present? Martha Henley stood nervously. I am. Did Mr. Boonhart purchase a leather pouch from you recently? She glanced at Boonhart, then straightened her spine. 3 days ago, he was very specific about wanting one with space for initials to be added. The tide was turning. Watson leaned forward, interested now. Let's hear from the defense, he ordered. Hartwell called Daniel Morrison first. The young man, nervous but determined, read from his journal in a clear voice. Entry after entry detailed Boonhart's pursuit of Sarah, his increasingly aggressive advances, his threats against anyone who interfered. October 3rd, Daniel read. Mr. Boonhart cornered Miss Sarah by the supply wagon, grabbed her wrist when she tried to leave. She said no, clear as day. He said she'd regret refusing him. October 7th, Mr. Boonhart told me to stay away from Miss Sarah. Said he'd make sure I never worked another wagon train if I didn't. Said she was already his. She just didn't know it yet. October 15th, Mrs. Thompson had to threaten Mr. Boonhart with her rifle to make him leave the cook tent. He'd been pressing Miss Sarah to sign some papers. She refused. He said he'd make her sign one way or another. Pearl Hawthorne testified next, bringing 2 of her girls with her. They spoke carefully but clearly about Boonhart's behavior in the saloon, his boasts about taming women who thought they were too good for him. He said he had ways of making women see sense. One girl testified, said sometimes you had to break them first before they'd appreciate what you offered. Then came the surprise witness. Adelaide Thompson herself had arrived that morning, having ridden hard for 2 days when she heard about the trial. The wagon master's wife was a formidable woman, and her testimony was devastating. I saw that man terrorize Miss Sarah for weeks, she stated firmly. She was a good girl, hard-working, kind, never encouraged him, never led him on. He just wouldn't accept that she wasn't interested. She looked directly at Boonhart. The night before he took her, he told my husband that he'd have her one way or another, said he always got what he wanted. And the night he took her, Watson prompted. Came with 5 men and a paper he claimed she'd signed. We knew it was false. Sarah had been with me all evening the day he said she signed it, but he had guns, and we had families to protect. Her voice cracked. To our shame, we let him take her. Finally, Sarah herself took the stand. Hartwell guided her through her story with gentle questions. She spoke simply, without embellishment, about her time with the wagon train, Boonhart's unwanted advances, the night he came for her. He said I owed him for insulting him, said refusing him publicly had cost him face. He hit me when I tried to run. She touched her face where the bruises had been. Tied my hands, put me on a horse, but I got loose that night and ran. Why didn't you go to the law immediately? Aldrich asked on cross-examination. I was injured, lost, afraid. I just ran until I couldn't anymore. Mr. McCoy found me near death. He saved my life. How convenient. Aldrich sneered, finding a protector so quickly. Tell me, Miss Little Sparrow, what arrangement did you make with Mr. McCoy for his protection? Harlan started to rise, but Red Coleman's hand on his shoulder kept him in place. Sarah's eyes flashed. Mr. McCoy asked nothing of me, expected nothing. He gave me shelter when I needed it, protection when I was hunted, and respect when the world seemed determined to treat me as property. The only arrangement between us is friendship and mutual regard. Mutual regard, Aldrich repeated mockingly. Is that what you call it? I call it human decency. Sarah shot back. Something Mr. Boonhart knows nothing about. Watson had heard enough. Mr. Boonhart, take the stand. Boonhart swaggered to the witness chair, still confident despite the mounting evidence against him. Under Aldrich's friendly questioning, he painted himself as a successful businessman taken advantage of by a scheming woman. But Hartwell's cross-examination was masterful. Mr. Boonhart, you say Miss Little Sparrow signed this contract willingly? She did. In your tent? Yes. With witnesses present? Of course. Then why? Hartwell asked quietly. Does Mrs. Thompson's testimony place Miss Little Sparrow in her wagon at that exact time, helping deliver her grandson who came early? Boonhart's mouth opened and closed. And these witnesses of yours, how much did you pay them? I didn't, that's slander. Is it Mr. Boonhart? Isn't it true that you've paid these men before to swear to things that weren't true? Didn't you use these same witnesses to claim ownership of the Carson family's water rights last year? That was different. Was it? Hartwell's voice rose. Isn't it true that you've built your fortune on intimidation and false claims, that you use your money and hired guns to take what you want? I'm a businessman, Boonhart snarled. Sometimes business requires firm tactics. Firm tactics. Hartwell nodded. Like hitting a woman, tying her up, dragging her away from her employment against her will. She owed me, she led me on, made promises. What promises when where you've provided no evidence except a clearly forged contract and a recently purchased pouch with fresh initials? Boonhart's composure cracked completely. She thought she was too good for me, high and mighty cook girl. Acting like she was something special, I offered her everything, a place in my business, my protection, my name eventually, and she threw it in my face in public. The courtroom fell silent at this outburst. Watson's expression was grim. So you decided to take by force what wasn't freely given? I took what was mine by right, Boonhart shouted. A man's entitled to collect his debts. But there was no debt, Watson said quietly. Was there, Mr. Boonhart? Just your wounded pride. The verdict, when it came, surprised no one who'd been listening. Watson dismissed all charges against Sarah, declared the contract a forgery, and issued a warning to Boonhart about harassment. He stopped short of criminal charges, the evidence of kidnapping, while compelling. Wasn't quite enough for frontier justice, but his message was clear. As people filed out of the courthouse, Boonhart pushed through the crowd to confront Sarah on the steps. This isn't over, he hissed. You think you've won, I don't need a court to collect what's mine. Mr. Boonhart. Red Coleman stepped between them, hand on his gun. I believe the judge made himself clear. Move along. You can't protect her forever. Sheriff, she has to leave town sometime. Has to be alone sometime. Actually, Pearl Hawthorne announced loudly, she doesn't. Miss Little Sparrow has accepted my offer of employment. She'll be managing the kitchen at the Silver Dollar, living on the premises, under my protection and that of my employees. She smiled dangerously. All 20 of them, armed employees, Mr. Boonhart, who've dealt with troublesome men before. The crowd that had gathered murmured approval. Several men stepped forward, ranchers and townsmen who'd had their own run-ins with Boonhart over the years. The lady's under the town's protection now, one said firmly. We've tolerated your bullying for too long. Boonhart, it stops here." Boonhart looked around. Seeing former allies step back, former victims step forward, his power, built on fear and intimidation, was crumbling in the face of collective courage. "This isn't over," he repeated, but the words lacked force. He turned and stalked away, his hired men trailing uncertainly behind. Sarah stood on the courthouse steps, overwhelmed. The town that had whispered about her, judged her, was now standing with her. Pearl's offer was generous, but more than that, it was public acceptance, a place in the community. I don't know what to say," she managed. "Say yes," Pearl advised. "Good cooks are hard to find, and I suspect you're tired of hiding." Sarah looked at Harland, seeking his reaction. His face was carefully neutral, but she saw something flicker in his eyes. Lost disappointment. "I need to think about it," she said diplomatically. "But thank you, all of you." The ride back to the ranch was quiet. Sarah could feel the questions building between them, but didn't know how to address them. It wasn't until they were inside the cabin that Harland finally spoke. "It's a good offer, safe, respectable, a chance to build a real life in town. Is that what you think I should do?" He turned away, busying himself with the coffee pot. "I think you should do what makes you happy. You've earned the right to choose your own path." "Harland," she moved closer, placed a hand on his arm. "Look at me." He turned reluctantly, and she saw the truth in his eyes. He thought she was leaving, thought she'd choose the safety and society of town over the isolation of his ranch. "Do you remember," she said softly, "what I told you the night I learned to shoot, that I was done running?" He nodded slowly. "I meant running from everything. From danger, yes, but also from possibility, from connection." She reached up, touched his scarred cheek. "From you. Sarah, Pearl's offer is kind, but it's not what I want. This place, this life we've built together, that's what I want. If you'll have me. If I'll—" He pulled her against him suddenly, fiercely. "Woman, you've turned my world upside down from the moment you stumbled onto my land. Made me care again when I'd sworn I never would. Made this empty house feel like a home. Of course I'll have you." She laughed against his chest, feeling the tension of the day finally release. "Good, because I already told Pearl I'd think about it, but I knew my answer. My place is here, with you." They held each other as the afternoon sun slanted through the windows. Two souls who'd found harbor in each other after storms of violence and loss. There would still be challenges. Boonhart wouldn't give up easily, despite his public defeat, but they'd face them together. "Partners?" Harland asked, echoing their agreement from days before. "More than partners," Sarah corrected, tilting her face up to his. "If you're willing." His answer was in the kiss that followed, gentle but sure, full of promise and hard-won trust. When they finally pulled apart, both were smiling. "I should warn you," Sarah said. "I really am a terrible baker. You might regret this when you taste my bread." "I'll teach you," he promised. "We have time now, all the time we need." And standing there in the cabin that had sheltered them both, they began to believe it was true. The immediate danger had passed, the town had shown its support, and they had each other. It was more than either had dared hope for when this journey began. Outside, the sun continued its path across the sky, marking the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Sarah Little Sparrow, who had fled in terror and found courage in sanctuary, was ready to build something new. Not alone this time, but with a partner who'd proven that strength could be gentle and protection could be freely given. The future stretched before them, uncertain but no longer frightening. They would face it as they'd learned to face everything else, together. The autumn morning dawned crisp and clear, 6 months after the trial that had changed everything. Sarah stood in front of the small building that would soon open as her cookhouse, running her hands over the freshly painted sign, Little Sparrow's Kitchen, all welcome. The letters were neat and precise, painted by her own hand with Harlan's patient teaching. "It looks fine," Harlan said from beside her, his voice warm with pride. "Your grandmother would be pleased." Sarah smiled, touching the leather pouch at her throat. "I think she would. A place where anyone can get a good meal, regardless of their station. Where the ranch hands don't have to go to the saloon just to eat." The past months had been a whirlwind of activity, with Pearl's backing and several townspeople's investments. Sarah had purchased the old feed store and transformed it into a dining establishment. Not fancy, but clean and welcoming, with long tables where cowboys could eat beside clerks, where traveling families could find affordable meals. "Are you ready for this?" Harlan asked, noting the way she twisted her wedding ring nervously. They'd married quietly 3 months ago, with only Red Coleman and Pearl as witnesses. Sarah had insisted on keeping her professional name for the business. Little Sparrow's Kitchen had a ring to it that Sarah McCoy's simply didn't. "As ready as I'll ever be." She straightened her apron, lifted her chin. "Whatever happens, I'm not hiding anymore." The morning passed in a blur of preparation. Several women from town had volunteered to help, including Martha Henley and, surprisingly, the minister's sister. They worked together efficiently, setting tables, preparing the simple but hearty menu Sarah had planned. Then, just as they were about to open, a familiar black horse appeared on Main Street. "Josiah Boonhart." He dismounted slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving the cookhouse, but something was different. Gone was the swagger, the implied threat. He looked older, diminished somehow. His empire had crumbled over the past months as more people found courage to stand against him, as business partners discovered his fraudulent practices. Sarah stepped out onto the porch, Harlan close behind. "Mr. Boonhart. Mrs. McCoy." He removed his hat, a gesture that surprised everyone watching. "I came to, that is," he stopped, started again. "I came to apologize." The street fell silent. Even the dogs stopped barking. "I was wrong," Boonhart continued, the words clearly costing him. "Wrong to pursue you when you'd made your feelings clear. Wrong to use force when persuasion failed. Wrong about many things." Sarah studied him, this man who'd terrorized her, hunted her, tried to own her. She saw what others might miss. The tremor in his hands, the hollow look of a man who'd lost everything he'd built on fear and lies. "Why now?" she asked simply. "Because I'm leaving, heading to California, starting over." He met her eyes directly. "And because my mother, God rest her soul, would be ashamed of what I became. She raised me better, but I forgot that somewhere along the way." "Words are easy," Harlan said quietly. "Actions matter more." "I know." Boonhart reached into his coat, and several men tensed, but he pulled out only a paper. "This is a letter releasing any and all claims against Mrs. McCoy, witnessed and notarized. Also," he hesitated, then pulled out a small bag. "The money I claimed you stole. We both know you never took it, but I said you did, so it's yours by right." Sarah made no move to take it. "I don't want your money, Mr. Boonhart." "Then give it to charity. Feed the hungry with it. I don't care. I need to leave with whatever shred of honor I can salvage." She looked at Harlan, saw him nod slightly. Trust, but verify. She took the paper, checked that it was properly witnessed, then accepted the money bag. "I'll use it to feed those who can't afford to pay," she said. "A free meal fund in your mother's memory. Would that suit?" Something flickered in Boonhart's eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or long-buried decency trying to resurface. She'd have liked that. "Thank you." He turned to go, then paused. "For what it's worth, McCoy, you're a lucky man. Don't forget that." "Every day," Harlan replied. "I remember every day. Boonhart rode away, and the town seemed to exhale collectively. Sarah stood watching until he disappeared, then turned to find half the town gathered in front of her cookhouse. "Well," she said, managing a smile, "I suppose you're all hungry. Let's see what Little Sparrow's kitchen can do about that." The opening was a tremendous success. Cowboys sat next to shopkeepers, sharing stories over Sarah's stew and cornbread. Children ran between the tables while their mothers actually relaxed for once, not having to cook. Pearl held court at one table, regaling listeners with tales of the old days that may or may not have been true. Daniel Morrison was there, now working as the town's new school teacher. He raised his glass of cider in a toast. "To second chances," he said, "and the courage to take them. To standing together." Red Coleman added, "Amazing what a town can do when folks stop being afraid." As the afternoon wore on, Sarah found a moment to step outside for air. Harlan joined her, slipping his arm around her waist. "No regrets?" he asked. "You could have had a quieter life on the ranch." "I'll have that too," she said. "The best of both worlds. Home with you, purpose here. It's more than I dreamed of when I was running through the dark." "You're not the same woman who knocked on my door that day." "No," she agreed. "That woman was broken, terrified, alone. This woman—" She gestured at the bustling cookhouse, the community that had embraced her. "This woman knows her own strength, knows she has people who'll stand with her, knows she has love." "Always," Harlan said firmly. "You'll always have that." They stood together watching the sun set over Willow Creek, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Inside the cookhouse, laughter rang out as someone told a joke, the sound of community, of belonging, of life moving forward. "I should get back in there," Sarah said, but made no move to go. "In a moment." Harlan turned her to face him. "I want to remember this. The day Sarah Little Sparrow truly spread her wings." She laughed, the sound bright and free. "From sparrow to eagle." "You were always an eagle. You just needed time to remember how to fly." As if on cue, an eagle circled overhead, riding the thermals higher and higher until it was just a speck against the infinite sky. Sarah watched it, thinking of her grandmother, of the strength that had carried her through darkness into light. "Thank you," she whispered, not sure if she was talking to Harlan, her grandmother's spirit, or the God who'd watched over her journey. Maybe all three. Then she squared her shoulders and walked back into her cookhouse, where hungry people waited for the food she'd prepared with her own hands, where she was needed, where she belonged. Harlan followed, as he always would now. The giant of a man who'd chosen isolation had found his way back to community through loving a woman who refused to be broken. Together they served meals and cleaned tables and built something good from the ashes of fear. As the last customer left that evening, Sarah stood in her empty cookhouse, tired but triumphant. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. There would be difficult days, setbacks, moments of doubt. But there would also be the knowledge that she'd faced her worst fear and emerged not just surviving, but thriving. "Ready to go home?" Harlan asked, holding her coat. "I am home," she said, taking his hand. "Wherever you are, that's home." They locked up the cookhouse and rode back to the ranch under a canopy of stars. The same stars that had witnessed her desperate flight now blessed her return. The cabin welcomed them with warm lamplight and the promise of peaceful sleep. As Sarah sat on the porch that night, watching the stars wheel overhead, she thought about the journey that had brought her here, from terror to triumph, from isolation to community, from existing to truly living. She'd learned that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. That strength could be found in vulnerability. That love could heal even the deepest wounds. The night wind whispered through the grass, and she could almost hear her grandmother's voice. "Well done, little sparrow. You've found your place." And she had not just a physical place, but a place in the world, a purpose, a future bright with possibility. She was no longer running, no longer hiding, no longer afraid. She was Sarah Little Sparrow McCoy, cook and businesswoman, wife and friend, survivor and thriver. She was free, and that freedom, hard-won and precious, was worth every moment of fear, every bruise, every tear, because it had led her here, to this moment, to this life she'd built with her own hands and heart. In the distance, a coyote called to its pack, and this time the sound made her smile. They were calling their family home, just as she had found hers. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new challenges, new joys. But tonight, she was simply grateful. Grateful for the man sleeping peacefully inside, no longer needing to keep constant watch. Grateful for the town that had become her community. Grateful for the strength she'd found within herself. Grateful for the journey that had transformed her from prey to predator, from victim to victor, from sparrow to eagle. The stars continued their eternal dance, and Sarah Little Sparrow McCoy danced with them in spirit, free at last, free at last. Her story, which had begun with violence and fear, ended with peace and joy. And in the vast tapestry of the frontier, where so many stories ended in tragedy, hers was a testament to the power of resilience, courage, and love. She rose, stretched, and went inside to join her husband. Tomorrow she would feed the hungry and welcome the stranger. Tonight she would rest in the arms of love, knowing that she had won not just her freedom but her life. The little sparrow had become an eagle indeed, and she would never be caged again. Thank you so much for listening to this story of courage, redemption, and the power of standing together. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss what this tale meant to you. If you enjoyed Sarah and Harlan's journey, please subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and hit that like button. And if you really want to help more people discover these stories of the American frontier, please hit the hype button to boost this video. Your support means everything and helps keep these tales alive. Until next time, partners.